America's richest 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. Let that sink in. 1% of the population, about the size of the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area, now controls more wealth than nearly everyone else in the country put together. Not the poorest, not more than the bottom half, more than the bottom 90%. That means most of us, your neighbors, your coworkers, your friends, your family, are all scraping by with a sliver of what this tiny elite controls. And yet, we're told that this is normal, that this is how the system is supposed to work, that if we just keep our heads down, work hard, stay in school, follow the rules, our time will come. But be honest with yourself. Does this feel like a system that's working for you? Because if it was, if the game were truly fair, if hard work always paid off, if the economy really rewarded effort, ambition, and sacrifice, would life feel this hard for this many people? Would rent eat up half your paycheck? Would a trip to the ER cost more than a month's wages? Would college degrees come with decades of debt? Would you be stuck in a job that doesn't cover your bills while working more hours than ever before? Would millions of people be living paycheck to paycheck while billionaires build private rockets? This isn't just about envy. This isn't about blaming success. It's about asking the deeper question: what kind of system produces this kind of imbalance? Because no matter how much we've been told to call it freedom or call it capitalism or call it the American dream, when the rewards of a society flow almost entirely to the top while the burdens are left for everyone else, that's not freedom. That's not fairness. That's not a dream. That's an illusion. And somewhere inside, most of us already know it. We feel it in the stress that never goes away, in the exhaustion of working harder but falling further behind, in the quiet fear that if something goes wrong, an illness, a layoff, a broken car, there's no safety net waiting, just the edge of a cliff. So the question isn't just, how did this happen? It's why we let it happen and what we're going to do about it. Because this level of inequality didn't just appear overnight. It was designed, engineered, grown, protected. And until we understand how we got here, how this economy was built, who it was built for, and who it leaves behind, we're going to keep mistaking decline for destiny. So that's what this series is about. Pulling back the curtain, asking uncomfortable questions, challenging the stories we've been told, and imagining what might come next. Because this isn't just a glitch in the system. This is the system. And it's long past time we took a closer look. We're told constantly that we live in an era of prosperity, and the numbers back it up. Global GDP is higher than it's ever been. Technological innovation moves at a staggering pace. Corporations post record profits quarter after quarter. Unemployment, on paper at least, is low. The Dow Jones climbs. The S&P breaks new records. Economists talk about growth, efficiency, and productivity. If you're looking at it from a distance, the system seems to be thriving. Machines hum in factories, those that haven't been shipped overseas. Automated warehouses sort and ship products in seconds. Logistics algorithms calculate the cheapest, fastest delivery route down to the minute. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, and data analytics have made it possible to manage global supply chains with a precision no previous generation could have imagined. You can buy almost anything with the tap of your finger: groceries, rides, furniture, clothes, medication. Apps have collapsed the space between buyer and seller, customer and service. A pizza or a prescription is just a few clicks away. The world is now more connected, more efficient, and more capable of producing and distributing wealth than at any point in human history. And yet, for millions of people, everything feels harder. Wages haven't just stagnated, they've fallen behind. For most workers, pay increases haven't come close to keeping up with inflation, let alone the skyrocketing costs of housing, healthcare, childcare, transportation, or education. It's not just that things are more expensive, it's that they feel out of reach. A decent apartment in a major city? Out of reach. Home ownership? Delayed or abandoned altogether. Having a child? Financially terrifying. College? A lifetime of debt. Getting sick? A possible bankruptcy. Even a small emergency, a car repair, a dental bill, a sudden rent hike, can send an entire household into a spiral. More and more, people are living paycheck to paycheck, with nothing in savings, no margin for error, and no exit ramp. They're working longer hours, picking up side gigs, driving for rideshare services, delivering food, freelancing, doing jobs that didn't exist a generation ago, often with no benefits, no job security, no protections, and no clear path forward. In this new economy, you can be busy all the time and still feel like you're falling behind. Meanwhile, at the top, there's an entirely different reality. Corporate profits have not just grown, they've exploded. A few multinational giants dominate entire sectors. Tech firms, logistics giants, private equity firms, investment banks. Many of them have posted the highest earnings in their history. Executive compensation is now measured in hundreds of millions. Billionaires are not only more common, they're richer than any elites in modern history. The richest individuals now possess fortunes greater than the GDP of entire countries. And the wealth gap? It's not just widening, it's accelerating. The richest 1% now hold more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. Just think about that again for a minute. 90% of the population, hundreds of millions of people, own less than a sliver of the pie, while a handful of individuals own more than the rest put together. We're told this is the price of progress, that this is normal, that if we just work harder, climb the ladder, get a degree, hustle, adapt, our lives will improve. But for most people, the ladder has been kicked away. Degrees come with debt. Hustle has no ceiling. And the promised future keeps receding, just out of reach. So, we're left with a paradox. A nation that generates more wealth than any society in human history, while tens of millions struggle to pay rent, to see a doctor, to keep food on the table. How did this happen? How did we get to a place where abundance exists all around us, yet scarcity defines our lives? The truth is, this didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a single decision or a single administration or a single crash. It was a long, slow unraveling. A shift that began decades ago, quietly, methodically, and often invisibly, until one day we woke up in a country where working full-time no longer guarantees stability, let alone prosperity. To understand the roots of this crisis, we have to go back. Back before the gig economy, before the crash of 2008. Back before globalization, before outsourcing, before the rise of finance. We have to pull back the curtain on a story we've been sold and look at how the system was redesigned piece by piece, to favor capital over labor, profit over people, growth over dignity. Because if we don't understand how we got here, we'll never understand why things feel so broken now, or what needs to change to build something better. There was a time, roughly between the end of World War II and the mid-1970s, when America had something close to an economic miracle. Not for everyone, not equally, but for hundreds of millions of people. The American dream wasn't just a slogan. It was a reality they could reach out and touch. A single income could support a family, not just scrape by, but thrive. You could own a modest home. You could buy a car. You could take vacations. You could send your kids to college and retire with a pension, all on the wages of a factory worker, a clerk, a teacher, a nurse, or a postal employee. This was the era of the broad middle class, when prosperity was not just rising, but shared. Between 1945 and 1973, productivity soared, and so did wages. As the economy grew, so did the income of ordinary Americans. Median family income doubled. Union membership was strong. Job security was real. And a rising tide, for once, did lift most boats. This was not a time without flaws, far from it. Black Americans were often locked out of the housing market through redlining. Women were pushed into narrow roles and paid far less than men. Indigenous communities, immigrants, and other marginalized groups were excluded from many of the protections that underpinned this economic order. But still, there was a broad-based sense of stability that spanned much of the working and middle class, across regions, across industries, across generations. This wasn't the result of some invisible hand or accidental good fortune. It was built, deliberately, by policy and pressure. Strong unions fought for wages, benefits, and safer working conditions, and they won. Progressive taxation made sure the wealthiest paid their share. The top marginal tax rate during the 1950s and early 60s was over 90%. That's not a typo. And yet, the economy boomed. Corporate accountability was more than just a buzzword. CEOs often earned 20 or 30 times what their average worker made, not the 300 to 400 times as is common today. Companies invested in their workers, in their communities, in long-term value, not just quarterly profits. Government investment was massive. The GI Bill sent millions of veterans, like my dad, to college and helped them buy homes. The federal highway system knit the country together. Public universities were funded. Public housing was built. Public utilities were expanded. And most importantly, America still made things. This was an age of the industrial economy. Steel, cars, appliances, electronics. Manufacturing jobs were the backbone of the economy. And they were the jobs you could build the life on. In towns and cities across the country, from Detroit to Pittsburgh, from Chicago to Cleveland, these jobs provided not just income, but identity, purpose, and pride. But beginning in the late 1970s, something began to change. Slowly at first, and then faster, and then all at once. The gains of the post-war era began to stall, and then to reverse. Wages flatlined, costs rose, job security eroded, benefits shrank, and pensions disappeared. The middle class stopped growing and began to shrink. And this unraveling wasn't random. It wasn't inevitable. It was driven by four interlocking forces: globalization, automation, financialization, and neoliberal policy. Each one chipped away at the foundation of that post-war stability. Each one shifted more risk on the workers and more reward to capital. Each one hollowed out the institutions that once protected the middle class and concentrated power in the hands of corporations and elites. Together, they rewrote the rules of the economy, not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding reprogramming of how value was defined, how labor was treated, and how wealth was distributed. By the time most Americans realized what was happening, the floor beneath their feet had already been lowered. Jobs were gone. Pensions were gone. Unions were weaker. The safety nets thinner. The costs higher. The promises of security, mobility, dignity, unfulfilled. And while the American dream still hung in the air as an idea, for many people, it was just that, an idea, a memory, a myth. But this didn't come from nowhere. It came from decisions, from policies, from a shift in ideology that redefined the role of government, the function of corporations, and the meaning of work itself. First came globalization. The idea was simple on the surface. Open up borders, tear down trade barriers, let goods, services, and capital move freely around the world. Create a global marketplace where everyone could compete. The best ideas, the most efficient companies, the leanest operations, they would win. It was sold as a win-win. Richer nations would get cheaper goods. Poorer nations would get jobs and investment. Everyone would benefit from the rising tide of global trade. But that's not what happened. What happened, especially in the United States, was something else entirely. Corporations realized they could move production overseas. Not just parts of it, all of it. Factories that had operated for decades in places like Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Indiana, were shuttered almost overnight. Jobs that paid union wages, offered health insurance and pensions, and sustained entire communities, they were packed up and shipped to countries where labor was cheap, regulations were minimal, and corporate taxes were low to non-existent. Steel mills went silent. Auto plants laid off entire shifts. Textile factories closed their doors for good. Electronics, furniture, appliances, clothing, all increasingly made somewhere else. China, Mexico, Vietnam, Bangladesh. Wherever wages were lowest and oversight was weakest. American capital followed. And what was left behind? Empty lots, rusted gates, boarded up storefronts, and foreclosed homes. Entire towns that once revolved around a single employer were hollowed out. Local diners, grocery stores, gas stations, all dependent on the paychecks that once flowed from the factory floor, withered and died. This wasn't just an economic shift. It was a social collapse. These weren't just jobs. They were livelihoods. They were identities. They were the connective tissue of entire communities, passed down from parent to child. You worked at the plant. Your dad worked at the plant. Your uncle, your neighbor, your coach, your pastor, they all did too. The plant sponsored the Little League team, funded the local parade, anchored the tax base that paid for the schools and the fire departments. When it closed, it wasn't just income that disappeared. It was meaning, pride, routine, dignity. But the architects of globalization had an answer. This was progress, they said. Creative destruction. The market doing what the market does, finding the most efficient allocation of resources. Yeah, some communities would suffer, but in the long run, things would be better. New industries would emerge. New jobs would replace old ones. People just needed to adapt. And how are they supposed to do that? Go back to school, get a degree, learn to code. But this wasn't advice. It was abandonment. There were no jobs waiting on the other side of that diploma. No roadmap for displaced workers in their 40s, 50s, 60s. Many of whom had spent their entire adult lives mastering a single trade. And even if they wanted to go back to school, college wasn't what it used to be. Tuition had exploded. State funding for public universities was slashed. Grants were replaced by loans. Community colleges were overwhelmed and underfunded. For the first time in modern history, an education became a death sentence instead of a ladder out. The very people most impacted by globalization, the working class, were told they had no one to blame but themselves if they couldn't compete. But the truth is, they were never meant to compete. They were collateral damage in a global race to the bottom, where the only real winners were multinational corporations, investors, and the political class that greased the wheels of trade deals and deregulation. NAFTA, CAFTA, and the WTO weren't just acronyms. They were milestones in the dismantling of American industry. And they were cheered on by both major political parties. The promises were lofty, but they rarely materialized. The jobs that left never came back. The benefits of cheaper goods never outweighed the loss of a stable income. The new economy turned out to be a gig economy, precarious, low paid, and stripped of security. And the communities that were gutted, they were left to sort it out on their own. Opioid addiction rose. Suicide rates climbed. Social trust eroded. People turned inward or lashed out. And still, the media, the experts, the economists kept insisting that this was for the best. But for millions of people, globalization didn't feel like opportunity. It felt like betrayal. Because it was. And it was only the beginning. While factories were being shipped overseas, another quieter transformation was unfolding right here at home. Automation. Not the science fiction kind, not the killer robots or sentient machines, although those might be preferable, but something far more subtle, far more pervasive. Automation didn't come with a bang. It crept in. One piece of equipment at a time, one software update at a time, one algorithm, one checkout kiosk, one app at a time. First, it was the obvious jobs, those on the factory floor. Assembly line workers were replaced by machines that didn't get tired, didn't take breaks, didn't join unions. What once took dozens of people now took a handful of technicians to oversee the robots. Then it came for the offices. Filing clerks, bookkeepers, receptionists, travel agents, all replaced or downsized as software could do in seconds what once took hours. Entire departments consolidated into a dashboard. Retail followed. Cashiers were replaced by self-check kiosks. Bank tellers replaced by ATMs. Customer service lines replaced by bots. And now automation is climbing the ladder. White-collar jobs, once seen as safe, are no longer immune. Artificial intelligence is learning to write legal briefs, design websites, diagnose illnesses, grade essays, trade stocks, generate code, and even compose music and art. The kind of jobs people were told to retrain into after being displaced from manufacturing are themselves now under threat. And here's the thing. Productivity didn't fall. It soared. We began doing more with fewer people. Manufacturing output increased, even as factories employed fewer workers. Office efficiency rose, even as payroll shrank. Retail chains grew, even as they hired fewer staff. In other words, fewer workers created more value. And as labor costs dropped, profits didn't just increase, they exploded. Companies slashed payrolls and raked in more revenue. Share prices soared. Executive bonuses hit new highs. Investors celebrated, but the people who actually made the productivity possible, the workers who trained the AI, who maintained the machines, who took on more tasks as colleagues were laid off, they didn't see the benefits. The gains from automation were not shared. They were captured by shareholders, by executives, by corporate boards whose primary mandate was to maximize value. for those at the top. And as that happened, something fundamental broke. The link between work and reward, between what you contribute and what you receive. The assumption that if you work hard, if you became more efficient, if your company grew, you'd benefit alongside it, that story died. Because even as workers became more productive than ever, their wages stayed flat. As technology amplified output, living standards for most people stagnated or declined. The gap between what people produced and what they were paid to produce it grew wider and wider. And the gap became a chasm. In the post-war economy, productivity and wages used to rise together. If workers helped the company do more, they got a share of the reward. That's how the middle class was built. But beginning in the late 1970s, that relationship fractured. Productivity was rising, wages didn't. And that disconnection didn't just harm individual workers. It hollowed out entire communities. Because when workers don't share in the gains, they can't spend. When wages stagnate, so does demand. When people work harder for less, the economy might grow on paper, but it grows in a way that benefits fewer and fewer people. Meanwhile, corporate leaders insisted that this was just the march of progress. Technology creates new jobs, they said. Efficiency leads to growth. It's just a transition. But what kind of transition lasts 40 years? And where exactly is it transitioning to? Because if efficiency always leads to growth, and growth always leads to prosperity, then why aren't we all prospering? The truth is, automation didn't kill jobs. It killed good jobs. It replaced stable, decent-paying work with fragmented, insecure, low-wage gigs. It replaced human labor with capital and funneled the rewards to the owners of that capital. And it's not over. Automation is accelerating. AI is advancing faster than anyone predicted. The next wave won't just threaten blue-collar work. It'll shake the foundations of medicine, education, journalism, design, transportation, finance, virtually every field. This future isn't just arriving, it's disrupting. But disruption for who and to whose benefit? That's the question we need to ask, because if we don't change the way value is distributed, if we keep allowing efficiency to mean fewer people, lower wages, higher profits, then we're not headed toward a more advanced society. We're headed toward a more divided one. A society where the machines do the work, and the profits go to those who own the machines. And everyone else? They're left competing for the scraps. As wages flatlined and jobs disappeared, something else began to rise. Quietly at first, then relentlessly. Not new factories, not new industries, but a new economy altogether. One that didn't build wealth by making things, but by extracting it from the people who still had to live to survive, in a world where work no longer paid. This was the era of financialization. Banks, hedge funds, private equity firms, names that once sat on the periphery of economic life, suddenly moved to the center of it. They didn't create. They didn't manufacture. They speculated, leveraged. They bought up companies, cut jobs, gutted pensions, sold off the pieces, and walked away richer. Wall Street became more powerful than Main Street. Speculation replaced innovation. Manipulation replaced competition. And most important, debt replaced income. People didn't stop spending. They couldn't afford to, not really. So they did the only thing they could. They borrowed. They borrowed to go to college because now every decent job required a degree, like a barista. They borrowed to go to the doctor because healthcare had become a luxury. They borrowed to buy homes, not to build wealth, but just to secure basic stability in a market now ruled by investors. They put groceries on credit cards. They racked up medical debt from a single emergency room visit. They took out payday loans to cover rent. And when their children grew up, they handed them the same playbook: borrow to survive. This wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a misstep or a failure of good intentions. This was the system. A system where lending money was more profitable than paying people. Where homes weren't seen as shelter, but as assets to flip and hoard and rent back to the very people who used to own them. Where student loans were packaged, bundled, and traded like securities, turning a generation's future into someone else's dividend check. And all the while, the burdens grew heavier. Wages stayed still. Costs went up. And the people doing the borrowing, the workers, the dreamers, the parents, the students, were told it was their fault for not managing money better, as if the problem was budgeting, not the fact that the whole economy had been re-engineered to pull wealth up instead of letting it circulate through. Financialization turned every aspect of life into a revenue stream for someone else. A system built not to reward work, but to monetize necessity. Your need for housing? Someone's investment vehicle. Your need for education? Someone's passive income stream. Your need to survive? Collateral. And it wasn't sustainable, but it was profitable. So it continued. Until now. Now, we're all living in the ruins of that transformation, where billionaires ride rockets into space and millions can't afford an unexpected $400 bill, where GDP rises, but food insecurity does too, where the cost of living climbs, but wages never catch up. This is the world financialization made, not a world of abundance, but of engineered scarcity. Not a world of opportunity, but of lifelong obligation. Debt as destiny, profit as morality, and collapse as background noise. But even this isn't the end of the story, because another transformation is already underway. One even more disruptive and more defining. None of this happened by accident. Behind every lost job, every rising debt burden, every shuttered factory, every underfunded school, there was a policy choice, a vote cast, a deal struck. Because beginning in the late 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s, the United States and much of the Western world adopted a new economic ideology, one that would reshape not just how we work or earn, but how we live. It was called Neoliberalism. And it sold itself as freedom. Freedom from regulation, from taxes, freedom from government interference. A rising tide that would lift all boats if we just let the market run its course. It sounded good, efficient, rational, modern. But here's what it actually meant in practice. Massive tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy, sold to the public as trickle-down economics. Aggressive deregulation of industries, finance, energy, media, healthcare, until oversight was seen as an inconvenience rather than a responsibility. Union busting, both legal and cultural, until organized labor was vilified and power was stripped from the very institutions that had once fought for weekends, benefits, and decent pay. Free trade agreements that promised cheaper goods but delivered outsourced jobs, gutted towns, and race-to-the-bottom wages, while enriching multinational corporations. Privatization of public services, from prisons to schools to utilities, turning human needs into profit opportunities. And the steady erosion of the social safety net, reframed not as a moral obligation, but as a burden, an entitlement, a drain. Neoliberalism reframed the role of government, not as the steward of collective well-being, but as a facilitator of market growth. Government wasn't supposed to protect you from economic hardship. It was supposed to get out of the way. Private enterprise could solve it, but it didn't solve it. It exploited it. As the public sector shrank and power concentrated in fewer hands, corporations didn't just grow richer, they grew more powerful. They began writing the very rules that governed them. Lobbyists flooded Washington. Regulatory agencies were hollowed out or staffed with industry insiders. The line between public interest and private gain blurred, then vanished. And corporations, they stopped being participants in the economy and became the economy. They dictated wages. They determined access to health care. They shaped the information you receive, the education your kids got, the food you ate, and the communities you could afford to live in. They told you what to value, what to buy, what your life should look like. And if you couldn't afford that life, well, they offered financing. Because the American dream wasn't something you earned anymore. It was something you could lease at a 23.9% APR. And then the whole thing came crashing down. In 2008, the illusion shattered. The financial elite, those same institutions that had spent years repackaging risk as profit, turning people's homes into chips on a casino floor, pushed the system too far. Banks issued loans they knew would fail. They bundled bad debt into toxic assets and sold them as gold. Wall Street made billions on paper until reality caught up. And when the house of cards collapsed, it wasn't just gamblers paying the price. It was the people, ordinary Americans. Millions lost their jobs. Millions lost their homes. Millions lost their retirement savings, their security, their sense of stability almost overnight. And who did the government rush to rescue? Not the homeowners, not the working families, not the students drowning in debt or the communities gutted by austerity. No, they saved the banks, the very institutions that caused the crisis. They bailed out the speculators, the CEOs, the shareholders, with trillions in public money. They told us it was necessary, that these firms were too big to fail, that if the financial system crumbled, everyone would suffer. So we held our noses and watched the lifeboats get filled, not by the drowning, but by the ones who steered the ship into the iceberg. And then we were told to tighten our belts, to accept foreclosures, to live with stagnant wages and slash services, because we just couldn't afford it anymore. That was 2008. And if we hoped that it was a one-time betrayal, a glitch in the system, 2020 proved otherwise. The COVID-19 pandemic was a global emergency like nothing we had seen in a century. Hospitals overflowed, businesses shuttered, millions lost work, millions more died. Entire industries collapsed. Essential workers were praised as heroes while being sent to risk their lives without hazard pay or health care. And once again, when the panic hit Wall Street, the cavalry came running in. The stock market got a safety net. Corporations got emergency liquidity. Airlines got bailed out. Big business got help, fast, direct, and massive. The public? We got patchwork relief, a few checks, eviction bans with expiration dates, unemployment systems that buckled under the demand. And just like in 2008, the aftermath was revealing. The billionaires got richer, the corporations got stronger, and millions of Americans were left to pick up the pieces again. These weren't just economic disasters. They were revelations, moments of searing clarity, moments that showed in broad daylight how the system really works and who it's built to protect. Because when the stakes were highest, when the chips were down, the decision was made over and over again. Them, not you. The financial elite, not the families. The corporations, not the communities. The markets, not the people. This wasn't just mismanagement. It was policy by design. A system built not to serve you, but to extract from you, then abandon you when you fall. If you've ever felt like the economy was rigged, that your life is harder than it should be, that no one in power really sees you, you're not imagining it. That you saw the system's true face. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. This isn't sustainable. We all feel it, even if we can't always explain it. The economy where wages have barely budged in real terms since the 1970s, where rent, healthcare, childcare, and education skyrocket while your paycheck stays stuck, where the people who kept society running during a global pandemic, delivery drivers, nurses, teachers, grocery workers, are praised as essential, only to be cast aside when headlines change. This isn't an oversight. It's a systemic failure. This is what it looks like when capitalism stops working for the many and starts serving only the few. When billionaires grow their wealth by trillions during a crisis while families line up at food banks. When corporations announce record profits as they lay off workers and buy back their own stock. When the housing market becomes a playground for hedge funds and young people are told the reason they can't buy a home is because they ordered too much takeout. We're told to tighten our belts, to hustle harder, to invest in ourselves, to take on just a little more debt. But the truth is, the game is rigged, and people are waking up to it. What we are witnessing is not the triumph of the free market. It's the unraveling. We are living through the twilight of capitalism. Not because capitalism is inherently evil, not because markets are inherently flawed, but because we allowed profit to become more important than people. We allowed a system built for growth to outgrow its purpose. The invisible hand has become a clenched fist. This late-stage form of capitalism no longer rewards work. It rewards ownership. It no longer values stability. It prizes volatility that can be monetized. It doesn't invest in long-term well-being. It maximizes quarterly returns, often by cutting corners, slashing jobs, and externalizing harm. This is a system that mines not only the earth, but people, their labor, their time, their attention, their hope. And when they're depleted, it moves on, like any extractive industry. And eventually, something has to give. You can't build a stable society on economic quicksand. You can't keep asking people to sacrifice while the rewards keep flowing upward. You can't sustain a democracy when most people feel economically powerless. Because when a system stops delivering for the many, when it starts to feel like no matter how hard you work, you can't get ahead, when people lose faith that the future will be better than the past, they stop playing along. And that moment, that breaking point, that's not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new one. But only if we're brave enough to write it. The good news? We're not powerless. History is not a straight line. It zigs, it zags. It bends under pressure and pivots under protest. The systems we live under weren't handed down from the heavens. They were built by people, which means they can be changed by people. And this story, our story, isn't finished yet. But if we want a different ending, we have to understand the plot. We have to trace the threads that led us here. We have to name the forces that shaped our lives without asking our consent. We have to confront the uncomfortable truth that the rules of the game were never neutral and were never meant to benefit everyone. Because before we can change the system, we have to understand it. Before we build something better, we have to know what went wrong. That's what this series is about. Not just a history lesson, but a flashlight. A way to illuminate the choices we've made as a society and the choices we could make going forward. A challenge to question what we've been told is inevitable and imagine what's actually possible. Because if we keep playing by the old rules, the rules of extraction, domination, endless growth, and artificial scarcity, we're going to keep getting the same results. A world built for the few at the expense of the many. An economy that devours its own future. A society that treats dignity as a luxury and survival as a competition. But it doesn't have to be this way. Not anymore. We have the tools, we have the knowledge, we have the technology. And more than that, we have the people. People who are waking up, asking questions, telling the truth, building new models, planting the seeds of a different kind of future. The end of capitalism doesn't have to mean collapse. It could mean evolution, a turning point, a realignment, a reimagining of what the economy is for and who it should serve. Because if capitalism is in its twilight, then maybe the dawn is just the beginning to break. And maybe, just maybe, the next chapter is up to us.